Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's January 6th, 2022. It's our first discussion of the new year. It's coming on the anniversary of the dramatic events in the United States a year ago at the end of the Trump administration. We also are in a period of intense crisis, potential diplomatic activity to address it. Why don't we start with the coincidence of the uh, coming meetings, the NATO foreign ministers meeting, the U.S. Russia strategic dialogue, and so on, with the outbreak of what looks like a color revolution in Kazakhstan. Helga, do you think there's a connection there?
Well, if you would have asked me a week ago, do you expect some effort to disturb the diplomatic offensive coming mainly from Russia and China to defuse what was building up clearly as a double Cuban crisis with the development around Ukraine and Taiwan, I would have said one should absolutely expect a provocation to disrupt these meetings. And here we are. Now, uh, let me first state the positive aspect. I mean, there was a certain breakthrough announced just a few days ago that for the first time, the P5 UN nations, that is the permanent five nuclear armed nations, agreed on reaffirming the very important statement which was negotiated between Gorbachev and President Reagan at the time, that a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought. And this was the first time that these five nuclear powers agreed on such a statement. This has never happened before. So that as such is a very important breakthrough, but naturally all the interested parties and observers have to also note that now the words must be followed by deeds, and that statement as such, while it is extremely important, does not yet diffuse the crisis around Ukraine nor the crisis around Taiwan. But as I said, it's a very first important step. And then naturally we have these other meetings you just mentioned on January 10th and 11th, the U.S. Russia Strategic Stability talks in Geneva, which are also supposed to discuss the U.S. response to Putin's demand that these two treaties be signed, where he demands that the United States and NATO must give guarantees that Ukraine is never been uh, invited or taken into NATO, and secondly, that NATO will not expand further to the east towards the borders of Russia. Now, that demand, Putin has drawn the red line, and he said, this is not a negotiation posture, but this, he insists, has to be signed. And if it's not signed, it will have a dramatic response because it pertains to the very vital existential security interests of Russia. So, then this was supposed to be in Geneva the next day on January 12th, the NATO Russia meeting in Brussels, where now all of a sudden there will be a preparatory NATO foreign minister meeting on the 7th, that is tomorrow. And the Russian, I think, Deputy Foreign Minister Khrushchev already said, this is not good, because whenever these foreign ministers meet, it's more trouble. So this may actually even, make it more difficult for this summit in Brussels. And then one day later in Vienna, the OSCE discussion around the same subject. So this, is a diplomatic framework in the context of which, certain steps could be expected, certain progress hopefully would come out. And therefore, naturally, what has erupted now in Kazakhstan, um, is is really extremely ominous, and we have to make a full investigation of the elements which are going into it. Now, formally, these unrests, which erupted within 2 days in many cities in obviously a coordinated way, quite violent. In Almaty, the government building was occupied. So this was triggered formally by the elimination of subsidies by the government for the gas prices, which doubled as a consequence, and the population reacted very strongly to that, given the fact that the inflation rate in Kazakhstan was already severe. But then, within hours, really, or a day at most, something else happened. The demonstrations against the gas price were, added, or had an added element by a lot of NGOs who brought in the typical kind of color revolution demands like democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, all the things we normally know from other color revolutions. And it now appears that uh, the former energy and environment minister, whose name is something like I don't have it right now, that he was in jail because of embezzlement in Kazakhstan. Then he had exile and has exile in France, and now it seems that he is coordinating these demonstrations from Kiev via Facebook. I mean, this needs to be verified, and this is very hot information, because events are sort of uh, galloping, so one has to take all of that with a grain of salt, but that's what it looks like. And he was known, this banker, a previous banker, also was known to be the main opponent of Nazarbayev, who resigned 2 years ago. And it seems that he is trying to topple even the present government. So, this would completely fit, and then naturally the present government has called CESTO, that is the security organization which involves many of the states, Kazakhstan, some of the Central Asian republics, Russia, Georgia, and has called the troops in from this CESTO organization. They are already on the ground, and naturally there is a strong Russian component among these soldiers, but this is all legal because the president called them in for defense, and that's a completely legitimate thing. But it is ominous, nevertheless, that this occurs just days before these extremely important diplomatic meetings take place. Then, naturally, one thing one has to investigate is, what actually led to this increase of the gas price, because all of a sudden, market price reforms were introduced, which led to this increase of the prices, which triggered the whole thing. And that, again, is a typical MO, that some legitimate protests are then mixed with these color revolution things. And there are many NGOs in Kazakhstan financed by the West, and this has all the earmarks of what happened at the Maidan in 2014. The MO is exactly the same. There is possibly an ISIS component, because a little while ago, some of the previous ISIS fighters were repatriated with their families. So that's exactly what happened also in the Maidan, that the very violent component of these demonstrations were ISIS. And so this is a very complex situation. And naturally, also to be investigated is the role of Tony Blair, who is an advisor to the government. And, whenever Tony Blair is involved in anything, you better watch out, because Tony Blair was the father of the endless wars. He declared the right to protect. He advised the U.S. In their health reforms way back, which led to the privatization of the health reforms, which was basically a dismantling of healthcare. And naturally, the fact that he was now knighted by the Queen to the highest order of the British Empire is a complete farce, given his long list of wrongdoings, to put it mildly. And it is not a miracle that in Great Britain, within 3 days, more than 700,000 people signed the opposition to this, him being ordered a knight. Now, this is an anachronism all by itself. In the modern times, to have the monarchy knighting somebody for their services is really like of a fairy tale from the Middle Ages. But fortunately, there seems to be some strong opposition against this in Great Britain. And fortunately, this will highlight the evil role of Blair all the more. But this is very dangerous, what is happening in Kazakhstan, and we will go on a full investigation of all the elements involved. There are elements of Soros financing, NGO financing, and if this turns out to be a Western instigated effort to derail these diplomatic meetings, which are extremely important because we are on the verge of a Cuban Missile Crisis, much worse in a certain sense, because people are less cool-headed on the side of the transatlantic alliance. Then this will be something which needs the gravest attention and alert of the whole population.
Already, the Biden spokesman, Jen Psaki, came out and said that there's no evidence of a U.S. involvement and it's just usual Russian disinformation. So they're already expecting that there would be an investigation. Now, on the strategic situation, there's another significant development. The new foreign minister from Germany, Annalena Baerbock, met with Tony Blinken yesterday. Again, this is in the build-up toward the upcoming meetings. And it appears as though there may be some possible change going on within the new German government, but from the meeting, it sounds as though Blinken and Baerbock were on singing the same tune about Russia.
Yeah, my characterization of Baerbock as a NATO loudspeaker, which I said many months ago, unfortunately seems to be exactly right. I mean, this woman, I think it's the worst possible, post she could have, for her to represent Germany in this extremely dangerous moment, completely sign with Blinken, who is even, more bellicose than Biden. And he has just been running around the world trying to get the anti-China alliance in the Pacific. And, I mean, this is just for a German foreign minister to be so absolutely unconscious of the history of the 20th century, the role Germany played in the war against Russia in the Second World War, which caused 27 million lives to be lost, the very generous role of Russia in the period of the German unification. And, one should not forget, and we talked about that last week, we just published a chronology which makes, based on authentic documents, makes absolutely clear that it was not Russia's fault what happened in Ukraine or any other place. It was the continuous breaking of NATO, by NATO, of promises not to expand to the east, and many other such broken promises and clear-cut provocations. So now for Baerbock to, just rush to the United States to try to meet with Blinken and Pelosi and then turn around and not in the slightest try to get involved in a dialogue with Russia, which would be much more urgent at this point, given what's at stake, namely the existence of Germany. Because if this Cuban crisis goes in the wrong way, the first country to vanish is Germany because of the U.S. nuclear weapons which are located in Germany. So I think this is absolutely horrible, and hopefully one can only hope that Chancellor Scholz, who has announced a new start in the relationship with Russia, that he pulls in this Baerbock, and I mean, this is disgusting. I mean, this is like, I mean, I can hardly find words for uh, such a behavior, which is to say it's unpatriotic is the understatement of the year. I think it's really a NATO puppet, this woman. So I think this will hopefully lead to her early resignation, because the self-interest of Germany and such a person in such a post are incompatible.
Helga, let me pose a broader question to you, which is that the discussion around this whole upcoming conference, with Putin's demands for these new treaties, the whole question of in the background now, people are starting to worry about the Russia China alliance. Does this change things? Some people are even saying the US should pull back from the threats against Russia because that's driving Russia towards China. But this is the old geopolitical handbook. I mean, is it possible that they don't understand that Eurasian integration represents a positive development, not just for Russia and China, but for the West? And that's always been the position that you and your late husband took.
Well, I think what becomes very, very clear is that, the cooperation within Eurasia along the Eurasian land bridge, what then became the new Silk Road, and now the new Silk Road becoming the world land bridge, exactly as we have been working on for the last 30 years, and in reality much longer, but let's say last 30 years, that is in the self-interest of all the people of Eurasia, of industry, of labor, of just people of goodwill who want to have a peaceful future, is one thing. But then it is also clear that those people who think in terms of empire, uh, the interest of London, of Wall Street, of Silicon Valley, and of Frankfurt, one has to add, uh, they have a different perspective because they need to expand the empire. They need to continue to suck the blood out of the colonies, as we are seeing it in respect to the third world. And they naturally think that they have to be on this bellicose perspective. And I think that needs to be made clearer because all the problems we have, let it be the disgusting behavior in respect to Afghanistan or the effort to prevent the developing countries from developing, the absolute incompetence in the way the pandemic was handled. All of that comes from the fact that in most capitals in the West, in the United States and in Europe, you have governments which really are not pursuing the interest of the common good, but are pursuing the interest of the big banks, the financial oligarchy, big pharma, the cartels, maximization of profit, and they have managed to put in governments which are mouthpieces of their interest. And this is why in many countries of the transatlantic world, the population increasingly react with such a mistrust against the governments. In the United States, for example, uh, I was told yesterday by some of our colleagues that more than 200 congressmen are super rich millionaires. The others get millions from Wall Street because to have a congressional seat cost at least $5 million. For a Senate seat, you have to 10 times pay as much. So, it's a plutocracy. This has almost nothing to do anymore with democracy. And in Europe, with the parliamentarian system, it is absolutely the same thing. And you can see now with the coalition government that it doesn't really matter what you vote. You can vote Green, you can vote Liberals, you can vote Social Democrats, and you get all the same uh, cocktail because they make a compromise. And so it doesn't matter what you vote. It just demonstrates that this parliamentarian system and the way the presidential system in the United States has been undermined, that is really not representing what is in the Constitution of the United States, the need to respect the common good, and which is also in the basic law in Germany, which the chancellor and I think also the ministers have to swear an oath when they take office, namely that they will further the common good of the people and protect them against damage. They are not doing that. And I think this is a very dangerous mix because this all shows you in all of these areas I touched upon. And that means we need a mobilization of the population to force a reversal of this, a new paradigm in politics, which puts the common good up front. And that is a very practical question, even if people are not used to think this way. But we need 100% turnaround because this confrontation against Russia and China is suicidal.
Well, toward that end, you were again bringing up the importance of an intervention on Afghanistan, where David Beasley has once again warned that there are 8.7 million people on the brink of starvation. And I think he said 23 million people are facing that in the near future unless there's a change. And yet the West has still not moved on this. The money has not been unfrozen yet, despite some motion on this. And I understand the Schiller Institute will be holding an emergency conference on this. This really would be one area where there could be cooperation that would resolve some of these tensions, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, we have started to mobilize for Afghanistan actually since July, even before the Taliban took over. And, we have been now involved with this for 4 months, a little bit more than 4 months. And despite our efforts to, put pressure on the governments to unfreeze the funds from Afghanistan, which they illegally are holding, nothing has happened. The so-called donor countries who had basically financed 75% of the budget of Afghanistan up to the point the US left, cut this off suddenly. So, as the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan said in a recent speech, everybody knew when that money was cut, 75% of the budget, they threw the Afghan economy into a complete chaos. And that is now why you have a complete collapse of the economy in Afghanistan. No food, no money to import food, no medical supplies. And you have a genocide occurring in front of everybody's eyes, except that the media in the West stopped reporting about it already since several months. So, given the fact that they count on the short memory of the population, nothing is happening. But yesterday I raised this in a major way. What does it say about the West when we wittingly let the Afghan people die? 8 million people, or almost 9 million people dying right away, are in the process of dying. We hear the incredible stories about babies freezing to death, mothers having no milk for the babies, parents which are completely out of any means to even buy food for one day are selling their children for $40. I mean, this is unbelievable. And this is a mirror of the morality of the West. So I'm calling upon you to help us to mobilize to implement Operation Ibn Sina, which is the idea to start with a health system, modern hospitals in Afghanistan, and then take that as the beginning to build up the economy in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. This must be done. And, I think, what people have to understand is that the moral indifference, the depraved indifference the world is showing, or the Western world is showing towards Afghanistan, that is the same reason why people tolerate the behavior of the governments in respect to not managing the pandemic. The whole privatization of the health sector. After 2 years of the pandemic, we should realize that this is not functioning as long as you have profit in the health sector. Right now in the United States, the Omicron wave is out of control. And even if this is less lethal than the Delta, the fact that, this is overwhelming the health system. The governor of Maryland has just declared an emergency. This may happen in many more states because the health sector is completely at the edge. But that negligence not to protect the own population by building new hospitals, they closed hospitals during the pandemic in the United States and in Germany as well. So I think we need a complete reversal in priorities, and the population has to wake up that their indifference, your indifference, some of you, against Afghanistan is what allows these rotten policies to go on in our own countries. And we have to have a mobilization for a new paradigm, both within our countries and also among the relations among nations, because these are the same expressions of the same problem in the system.
And I would urge people to go to the Schiller Institute website and get the new Schiller Institute memo. Are we sleepwalking into thermonuclear World War III? This is the chronology you mentioned before. It will give you everything you need to know about the need to use these upcoming diplomatic meetings to move to a new security architecture as part of a move to a new paradigm. So, Helga, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, but we also have the year of LaRouche, so we will tell you more about our activities in this respect in the coming days.
Very good. See you next week.
Till next week.